So, you finished writing your essay, you've made some great points, you've said everything that you wanted to say. So, how do you tie your assignment neatly off at the end? Conclusions can be quite tricky to write because they can feel really repetitive. You've already said everything after all. The standard advice for essays is to say what you're going to say in the introduction, say it in the main body of the essay, and then say that you've said it in the conclusion. But you might find this feels a bit unsatisfying and you want to leave the reader with something a bit stronger to end on. But you can't add any new material in the conclusion, so how do you resolve that problem? A bit of repetition is inevitable. That's the conclusion's job. Imagine that as a reader, you've been following the argument, paragraph by paragraph, point by point, absorbed in the detail, thinking carefully about the points made at each step. You're looking at how they're evidenced and whether the reasoning makes sense. You reach the final point in the essay, absolutely focused on what it's saying, and that's it. It just ends. University assignments can be pretty long, and by the time they've reached your last point, readers won't have the earlier points fresh in their mind anymore. And because they've been paying close attention to each point in turn, it's going to be harder for them to see how the whole thing fits together. It's kind of disorienting. So if it was a film, your reader has been looking at something in sharp close-up, and what they need now is to zoom back out to a wide-angled framing shot so they can see all the points together and how they're related. They also want to know where all that leaves them. Where have they got to after all that? And that's the job of the conclusion. So to write a conclusion that's a bit more engaging to read, as well as a bit more interesting for you to write, put yourself in your reader's shoes and imagine what questions they have for you. Question 1, where are we? The first thing I'd recommend is going back to the original question that you were set, because the conclusion is quite simply your answer to that question. How is that question framed? What kind of answer does it require? For example, if it's a to what extent question, your answer will be a to a large extent or to a small extent kind of answer. If it's a why or explain how question, then your answer will be a for these reasons or in these ways kind of answer. So this approach really helps you to sharpen up your conclusion and make sure it actually fits the question that you were set. See if you can boil down your answer to the question in one sentence. That might be the first line of your conclusion. The second question is, how did we get here? Having told the reader where we've got to, you'll next need to remind them of how they got there. After a couple of thousand words or more, they will probably be a bit hazy on your points and how they all add up. You can remind them of the main points that you made on that journey and how it led us to your conclusion. So it's a brief summary, a brief overview. The next question that they have is, where does that leave us? You could leave a conclusion with just the first two questions, but there's a couple of nice twists that you could add. Now, you should never include new material in a conclusion. It's there to close things down, not open them back up again. And if something was that important, it really should have been addressed properly in the main body of the essay. It's not an afterthought at the end. But you can put things in a new light. One question your reader may have is, I know where I am and how I got here, but where does that leave me? Basically, so what? So what you could do is briefly discuss the significance of your conclusion. Now you've demonstrated your answer, how does that add to our overall understanding of this topic? What do we know? What can we do now that we couldn't before? If we hadn't explored this topic, where would we be? Why is your conclusion important? A follow-on to this question, and again very brief, is what next? What would come next? With a limit on your time and also a word count, there really is a limit to what you can do in an assignment, but especially if you're a second year, third year or at master's level, particularly in dissertations, you can touch on what further work might build on what you've already done. If there were areas that you couldn't cover or had to cut out due to the word count, this is quite a nice way to indicate that you have thought of them. It also shows awareness that you're thinking of your own work in the context of wider scholarship. So, looking at the conclusion from the perspective of the reader is a good way to make sure that your conclusion is a bit more engaging to read, as well as more interesting for you to write, and it gives your marker a clear and satisfying end to your assignment.